Close your eyes, and you can still smell the fresh biscuits baking in a 1960s kitchen. Back then, recipes were the heartbeat of the home. But today, those authentic classics are quietly vanishing. Today, we are diving into the historic Betty Crocker Heritage Collection to rescue 25 forgotten recipes before they disappear forever. How many of these do you remember? Let us start with number 25. We kick off our countdown at number 25 with a recipe that takes us back to the absolute foundations of American hearth cooking, Indian flatbread. To get this bread onto the table, your mom or grandma gathered a giant sack of gold medal flour, a tub of lard, and a can of baking powder. She mixed the dry ingredients, cut in the lard with a pastry blender, and added just enough warm water to form a soft dough. Then came a roaring, hot, seasoned cast iron skillet. Each portion was fried for exactly 2 minutes per side. When done right, they puffed up beautifully, boasting crisp, charred bubbles on the outside while remaining incredibly tender on the inside. They were served immediately, glistening with a generous brush of melted butter. Now, when a fresh, steaming basket of these hit the 1960s dinner table, a very specific ritual took place among us kids. We all wanted to dive across the table like wild animals. But instead, we put on a display of forced, agonizing politeness. Nobody rushed, because rushing was for fools who wanted to get sent to their rooms before the butter even melted. Coming in at number 24 is green tomato relish. By late September, the backyard garden was overflowing with unripened green tomatoes, and letting good produce go to waste was practically a mortal sin in the 1960s. To execute this rescue mission, out came the heavy, hand-cranked food chopper. You ground those firm green tomatoes alongside sweet yellow onions and crisp red bell peppers. One wrong turn of the crank and a jet of tart tomato juice would hit you square in the eye, a hazard your mother considered a character-building rite of passage. The ground medley was salted, drained overnight, and then slow-simmered in a heavy pot with a mountain of Domino granulated sugar, a massive splash of Heinz apple cider vinegar, and a pungent blend of mustard and celery seeds. It was then packed boiling hot into clear ball mason jars. At dinner, when the jar was opened, us kids would casually slide our plates forward with that same casual, calculated nonchalance. Because hasty movement meant you might miss out on pairing this tangy relish with your Sunday pork roast. Number 23. Midwest corn oysters. Next, we find one of the greatest mid-century culinary illusions ever to grace a Midwestern kitchen: Midwest corn oysters. You started by grating fresh kernels straight off the cob to release all that sweet corn milk. Then, you whipped up a light batter using a couple of large eggs, a splash of Borden's whole milk, a few tablespoons of sifted Pillsbury flour, and a pinch of salt. You didn't use modern vegetable oil for this. No, sir. You fried these babies in a skillet rippling with hot salt pork fat or bacon grease. You dropped the batter in tiny oblong spoonfuls, about the exact size of a real shucked oyster. As they fried to a deep, crispy gold, the outer edges became incredibly lacquered and crunchy, while the inside stayed soft, savory, and sweet. When a platter of these hit the table, we all practiced our best forced composure. They were eaten hot, mimicking the rich indulgence of real coastal seafood for pennies. But if you think corn oysters were a staple of Southern frying, wait until you see the absolute icon occupying our next spot. Number 22. Southern fried green tomatoes. Sitting proudly at number 22 is Southern fried green tomatoes. To get this classic on the table, your mother would use the firmest, most unyielding green tomatoes she could find. She sliced them into thick, uniform rounds, seasoned them with salt and pepper, and then set up the ultimate 3-bowl dredging station on the counter. First came a light dusting of Pillsbury flour, followed by a quick dip in an egg wash spiked with pet, evaporated milk. The final, crucial step was a heavy coat of coarse, stone-ground cornmeal, none of that fine-grained modern stuff that turns to mush in the pan. Out came the cast-iron skillet, rippling with smoking hot bacon grease or fresh lard. You laid the slices in gently, listening for that magnificent, aggressive sizzle. They were fried for 3 minutes on each side until the cornmeal coating turned a deep mahogany gold, locking the tart, steaming juices inside. When your mother set that platter down on the table, a heavy silence fell over the room. But us kids maintained our best hyper-polite dinner table manners. Number 21. Sweet potato biscuits. Next in our roundup is sweet potato biscuits. The process began when your mom or grandma would bake a couple of sweet potatoes until they were completely caramelized and oozing sugar. After scraping the vibrant orange flesh from the skins, she mashed them to smoothness with a heavy splash of melted Land O'Lakes butter. Next, she sifted together the dry ingredients, flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and just a whisper of brown sugar. She worked chilled shortening into the flour with her fingertips until it resembled coarse crumbs, then gently folded in the cooled sweet potato puree. The dough was rolled out on a floured board. Then, she cut out the rounds using the floured rim of an old jelly glass, placed them on a baking sheet, and slid them into a hot oven. They emerged from the oven boasting a gorgeous sunburst orange hue. When the basket hit the table wrapped in a clean dish towel to keep the steam in, the childhood standoff commenced. Number 20. Pennsylvania Dutch Chow-Chow. At number 20, we find a relic that sat proudly at the center of every self-respecting Pennsylvania Dutch dinner table: Chow-Chow. The process began when your mother decided to completely clear out the late summer garden harvest. Out came the massive stock pots, alongside bushels of crisp green beans, sweet corn, tiny cauliflower florets, red bell peppers, and lima beans. Every single vegetable had to be chopped by hand into uniform, microscopic pieces. The colorful medley was submerged in a heavy brine of Domino granulated sugar, white vinegar, mustard seed, and a generous pinch of turmeric to give it that signature, bright neon yellow glow. When it finished boiling, it was packed into mason jars and left to cure in the dark cellar. When a bowl of it finally made its way to the table, it was the ultimate test of a kid's willpower. We would sit there, eyeballing the vibrant yellow spread, waiting for our father to take the first spoonful so we could descend on it with our forks, trying to scoop up the sweet corn bits before anyone else could. Number 19. Deep South red beans and rice. During the mid-century era, Monday was traditionally wash day, meaning your mother's hands were full with heavy loads of laundry, a vintage Wringer washing machine, and clotheslines stretching across the backyard. She didn't have time to babysit a complicated roast, so she relied on the magic of the slow simmer. The foundation began with the leftover bone from Sunday's baked ham, which still had plenty of rich, smoky meat clinging to it. She threw it into a pot alongside chopped celery, onions, and bell peppers, the holy trinity of Southern cooking. In went a bag of dried red kidney beans and a healthy splash of water. By late afternoon, the starches in the beans would break down, creating a rich, velvety gravy that tasted like pure comfort. It was ladled generously over a mountain of fluffy, steamed Uncle Ben's white rice. You sat there, stomach growling, knowing that first savory bite was worth every second of the day-long wait. Number 18. Broiled cornmeal rounds. At number 18, we step back in time to a rustic skillet staple: broiled cornmeal rounds. It started with a boiling pot of water on the stove, into which your mother would slowly rain a steady stream of coarse Quaker yellow cornmeal. Once it thickened into a dense porridge, she poured the steaming mixture into an empty, greased tin can and slid it into the Kelvinator refrigerator to chill and set overnight. The next morning, she would slice that firm, cold cylinder into perfect, uniform rounds. Each round was brushed generously with melted Land O'Lakes butter, placed on a baking sheet, and slid directly under the oven's roaring broiler element. The outside became incredibly lacquered and shatteringly crisp, while the inside stayed as soft and smooth as custard. They were served roaring hot, drowning in a pool of log cabin syrup or a smear of apple butter. As the plate made its way down the table, You hoped your brother wouldn't snatch the last crispy round before you could load up your fork. Number 17. Creamed succotash. Next, we have a creamy, comforting heritage dish that spent decades as an absolute requirement of the mid-century dinner table: creamed succotash. Now, mention the word succotash to a kid today, and they will look at you like you are speaking a foreign language. But in the 1960s, this was a legendary pairing of sweet corn and lima beans that carried serious history. Your mom or grandma would reach deep into the freezer for a box of bird's eye frozen sweet corn and a package of frozen baby lima beans. She would melt a thick pat of butter in a saucepan, stir in a spoonful of Pillsbury flour to create a quick roux, and then slowly whisk in a generous pour of Borden's whole milk or heavy cream. The corn and lima beans were tossed into that velvety white sauce, alongside a pinch of sugar, salt, and plenty of freshly cracked black pepper. The mixture was left to bubble away until the beans were perfectly tender and the cream sauce coated the back of a spoon like liquid velvet. Some mothers would even crumble a few strips of crispy bacon over the top right before serving to ensure total cooperation from the kids. When that steaming bowl was passed around the table, you made sure to scoop deep from the bottom of the dish to secure the maximum amount of that rich, buttery cream gravy for your mashed potatoes. Number 16. Old-fashioned wilted lettuce. Sitting at number 16 is old-fashioned wilted lettuce. In the 1960s, nobody was eating raw kale or fancy store-bought vinaigrettes. If your mother wanted to serve a salad that the men in the family wouldn't openly protest, she relied on the ultimate Southern kitchen secret: hot pork fat. The preparation began with a colander full of crisp, tender leaf lettuce. After a thorough washing, the greens were patted dry and torn into a large wooden bowl alongside a generous handful of chopped green onions from the garden patch. The real action happened over on the stove. Your mother would fry up a half-dozen strips of thick-cut bacon in her trusty Lodge cast-iron skillet until they were shatteringly crisp. She lifted the bacon out but left that precious, smoking hot grease right there in the pan. Into that rippling fat went a healthy splash of Heinz apple cider vinegar, a spoonful of Domino granulated sugar, and a pinch of salt and pepper. While the dressing was still boiling hot, she poured it directly over the raw lettuce greens. You could hear a literal sizzle as the intense heat instantly collapsed and wilted the crisp leaves, forcing them to absorb that rich, smoky glaze. The crisp bacon was crumbled over the top, and the bowl was rushed to the table while still warm. It was the only time all week you would see kids actively fighting over who got the largest portion of leafy greens at dinner time. Number 15. Old-fashioned spoon bread. At number 15 is a majestic soufflé-like masterpiece that blurred the line between a traditional bread and a rich hot pudding: old-fashioned spoon bread. During the mid-century era, if your mother wanted to elevate a Sunday chicken dinner into an unforgettable event, she pulled out the heavy mixing bowls to whip up a batch of spoon bread. It started by scalding a couple of cups of Borden's whole milk on the stove, into which she slowly whisked a cup of fine-ground white cornmeal until it formed a thick, smooth paste. After pulling the pan off the heat, she beat in a generous chunk of Land O'Lakes butter and the beaten yolks of 3 large eggs. The absolute make-or-break step of the entire recipe rested on the egg whites. Using a hand-crank egg beater, she would whip those whites until they formed stiff, snowy peaks that looked like clouds. She gently folded those whipped whites into the cornmeal batter, poured the mixture into a greased Corningware casserole dish, and slid it into a steady oven. As it baked, the trapped air caused the bread to rise beautifully, developing a delicate golden brown crust that puffed up right over the rim of the dish. You didn't slice this bread with a knife. You scooped it out with a large silver spoon, watching it dissolve into a velvety, melt-in-your-mouth cloud the second it hit your plate. Number 14. Georgia Skillet Catfish. At 14 is a cornmeal-crusted staple that defined the weekend rhythm of the rural South: Georgia Skillet Catfish. In the 1960s, a proper fish fry was a serious community event. But your mother knew how to bring that exact same magic right onto the kitchen stove. She started with fresh, clean-tasting catfish fillets. After a quick rinse, the fish was dredged in a shallow dish of pet evaporated milk, which gave the batter enough body to stick to the skin. Next came a heavy toss in a mixture of yellow cornmeal, Pillsbury flour, a healthy pinch of paprika, and plenty of salt and pepper. Out came the massive cast iron skillet, filled with a shimmering layer of smoking hot armor lard. You drop the fillets in gently, letting them sizzle aggressively for about 4 minutes per side until the cornmeal coating formed a rigid, shatteringly crisp crust. Inside, the fish steamed to a perfect flaky tenderness that dissolved the second it hit your tongue. Served hot alongside a few lemon wedges and a side of hush puppies, it was a meal that made the whole family sit in appreciative silence. You made sure to clear your plate completely, hoping your mother would let you snag the final crispy tailpiece left warming on the platter. Number 13. Brunswick Stew. Coming in at number 13 is a thick, slow-simmered comfort classic that could feed a whole neighborhood for pennies. Brunswick Stew. Your mother would slow cook a whole chicken and a pork roast until the meat was so tender it fell away from the bone with just a gentle push of a fork. Once the meat was shredded, back into the pot, it went along with cans of Del Monte sweet corn, tender lima beans, and a mountain of chopped yellow onions. The real magic was the rich tomato base, sharpened with a splash of Heinz apple cider vinegar and a generous pour of Worcestershire sauce to give it that signature, tangy kick. It simmered on the lowest stove burner for an entire afternoon until it thickened into a hearty, spoon-coating masterpiece where the line between meat and vegetable completely disappeared. It was ladled hot into heavy stoneware bowls and served alongside a sleeve of salted premium saltines. By the time dinner was served, us kids were so completely worn down by the wonderful aroma that we wanted to clean our bowls before our parents could even sit down. Number 12. San Francisco Cioppino. At number 12 is a vibrant, tomato-rich fisherman's stew that brought a splash of California coastline to the 1960s dinner table. San Francisco Cioppino. This dish was a spectacular way to break up the winter monotony of heavy meat and potato dinners. Your mother would go to the local Piggly Wiggly to secure a selection of fresh white fish, a can of Del Monte tomato paste, and a couple of cans of whole peeled tomatoes. The foundation began on the stove, where she slow-simmered garlic, green bell peppers, and yellow onions in hot olive oil. In went the crushed tomatoes, a heavy splash of cooking wine, and a fragrant blend of dried oregano and basil that made the kitchen smell like an authentic Italian trattoria. The fish was nestled directly into that rich, bubbling red broth, gently steaming until it was perfectly tender and flaky. It was served piping hot in deep bowls, alongside a loaf of crusty sourdough bread to mop up every drop of that savory, garlic-infused sauce. Us kids would sit there, elbows on the table, carefully maneuvering our spoons to fish out our favorite pieces while the breadbasket traveled down the line. Number 11. Roast pork loin with sage and onions. Up next is the ultimate centerpiece of the traditional mid-century Sunday gathering: roast pork loin with sage and onions. Back then, Sunday afternoon was reserved for a long, formal family dinner. And this roast pork loin was the absolute gold standard of comfort cooking. Your mother would start with a beautiful, thick pork loin roast from the Safeway butcher counter. She rubbed the meat with salt, pepper, and a generous dusting of ground sage before searing it in a heavy roasting pan until a deep brown crust formed. Next, she surrounded the meat with a massive mountain of thick-cut yellow onions and a cup of rich broth. The pan went into a steady oven for a slow 2-hour roast while the family got dressed for church. As it baked, the onions completely broke down, caramelizing into a sweet, savory, sage-infused gravy that smelled absolutely heavenly. The pork was carved into thick, juicy slices and ladled generously with those tender, melted onions. When that platter hit the table, all the teenage boys in the house sat up straight, watching the slicing knife with intense focus to make sure the portions were distributed with perfect mathematical fairness. Number 10. Sourdough flapjacks. Sitting at number 10 is a rugged frontier breakfast classic that saw a massive resurgence across mid-century kitchens: sourdough flapjacks. In the 1960s, keeping a sourdough starter alive in the back of the Kelvinator refrigerator was a badge of honor for any dedicated home cook. The night before a big Saturday breakfast, your mother would feed that bubbling starter with a cup of gold medal flour and a splash of warm water. The next morning, she would scoop out that tangy, fermented sponge and gently fold in an egg, a tablespoon of melted butter, and a pinch of baking soda. The batter would instantly hiss and expand, filling with thousands of tiny, airy bubbles. She dropped large ladles of the dough onto a smoking hot, greased cast-iron griddle on the stove. They puffed up into thick, pillowy discs with incredibly lacy, crispy edges and a distinct, tangy aroma that woke the entire house up. They were stacked high on a warm platter and brought to the table alongside a jug of log cabin syrup. Us kids would watch the stack disappear layer by layer, silently tracking who was on their third pancake while trying to look completely innocent. Number 9. Philadelphia ice cream. Coming in at number 9 is a pure, rich, old-fashioned frozen luxury that defined the heat of a 1960s summer: Philadelphia ice cream. Unlike French-style ice creams that require a tedious, heat-sensitive egg custard base, Philadelphia ice cream was celebrated for its absolute purity. Your mother would mix just 3 basic ingredients in a large bowl: rich cream from the local dairy, Domino granulated sugar, and a generous splash of real vanilla extract. The mixture was poured into the metal canister of a heavy wooden hand-crank ice cream freezer. The real work fell to us kids, who were sent out to the back porch to take turns cranking that rigid handle while our dad packed crushed ice and rock salt around the barrel. You cranked until your arms felt like jelly and the handle physically refused to budge another inch. Your mother would pull the paddle out, giving us kids the absolute honor of licking off the thick, smooth ice cream clinging to the metal. It was packed down to harden for an hour, emerging as the smoothest, most intensely creamy vanilla treat you could ever taste. When those bowls were spooned out on the porch, a blissful silence took over as everyone melted into their lawn chairs to enjoy every single bite. Number 8. Hoosier Sugar Cream Pie. Our next entry proves that a mid-century mother didn't need a single berry or a chunk of chocolate to build the richest dessert in the county: Hoosier Sugar Cream Pie. In the 1960s, this was known as desperation pie because it came together from ingredients that were always sitting in the pantry, even in the dead of February when nothing was growing. Your mother would start with a simple, hand-rolled Crisco crust, pressing it into a tin pie plate and crimping the edge with the tines of a fork. Into that raw crust went a generous pour of Borden's whole milk or heavy cream, a thick blanket of Domino granulated sugar, a few tablespoons of Argo cornstarch to thicken things up, and a handful of small, cold pats of Land O'Lakes butter dropped right on top like little islands. That was it. No eggs, no fruit, nothing. It went into a hot oven and baked until the filling bubbled up thick around the edges and the whole top turned a deep, freckled caramel brown. Mom would pull it out and dust it heavily with cinnamon or nutmeg while it was still hot enough to melt into the surface. It had to cool completely before slicing, which was its own special agony. You'd walk past that pie cooling on the counter a dozen times, and every single time, Mom would materialize out of nowhere to swat a wandering hand away. But while this pie was a triumph of pantry thinking, our next entry was the undisputed anchor of the entire Sunday table. Number 7. Yankee pot roast. In the 1960s, Sunday wasn't Sunday without the smell of a roast working its way through the house by mid-morning. Your mother would head to the butcher counter at the Safeway for a tough, well-marbled chuck roast, the kind that needed hours of low heat to turn tender. She'd sear it hard on all sides in a heavy Dutch oven, with a slick of hot lard until it developed a deep brown crust. Then pull it out and build a bed of thick-cut carrots, quartered onions, and whole small potatoes right in the drippings. The roast went back on top, along with a splash of water, a spoonful of kitchen bouquet for color, and a bay leaf pulled from the spice cabinet. The lid went on, and the whole pot slid into a low oven for the entire church service, and then some. By the time the family walked back through the door, the house smelled like nothing else on earth, and your mother would pull that roast out fall apart tender, the vegetables soft and soaked through with meaty gravy. She'd thicken the pan juices right there with a spoonful of gold medal flour whisked into a slurry, pouring it into a gravy boat that got passed around with real ceremony. Carving that roast was your father's job, and every single kid at the table tracked the knife with total focus, praying for an end piece. Number 6. Perfection salad. This wasn't a salad in any sense we'd recognize today. It was a molded marvel built entirely on the strength of Knox unflavored gelatin, and having one on the table was practically a mother's calling card. She'd dissolve the gelatin in hot water and vinegar, then stir in a healthy dose of Domino granulated sugar and a splash of lemon juice for brightness. While that base cooled to a syrupy consistency, she'd finely chop crisp cabbage, celery, and pimento-stuffed olives, folding them in once the gelatin was just thick enough to suspend the pieces evenly instead of letting them sink to the bottom, which was considered a minor domestic catastrophe. The whole mixture got poured into a fluted copper mold and set in the back of the Kelvinator refrigerator to firm up for hours. Unmolding it was the real test of a mother's nerve. She'd dip the mold in a sink of warm water for a few careful seconds, say a silent prayer, and flip it in one clean motion onto a chilled platter lined with lettuce leaves. When it landed intact, quivering and translucent under the dining room light, it drew genuine applause. When it didn't, well, that was a story told at her expense for years. A dollop of Hellmann's mayonnaise on the side finished it off. Us kids mostly just liked watching the thing wobble. Number 5. Southern chicken and dumplings. At number 5 is a dish that could stretch one modest hen into dinner for a family of 8. Southern chicken and dumplings. In the 1960s, this was the definition of Sunday after-church comfort food, and it started well before anyone had even changed out of their good clothes. Your mother would set a whole chicken to simmer low in a heavy pot with celery, onion, and a few peppercorns, letting it work for a couple of hours until the meat slid clean off the bone and the broth turned rich and golden. She'd pull the chicken out, strip the meat, and strain that broth back into the pot, keeping it at a steady simmer while she turned her attention to the dumplings. Those were nothing more than gold medal flour, a spoonful of Crisco cut in with 2 knives, a pinch of salt, and just enough buttermilk to bring it together into a soft, sticky dough. She'd roll it thin right on a floured countertop and cut it into wide, uneven strips with a pizza cutter or a sharp knife. Those strips went into the simmering broth one at a time, and she'd resist the urge to stir too much, letting them cook undisturbed so they'd hold their shape instead of dissolving into mush. The shredded chicken went back in at the end, along with a splash of heavy cream to round everything out into something thick enough to coat a spoon. When that pot came to the table, everybody went quiet, purely focused on getting the thickest, most dumpling-heavy scoop into their bowl before the ladle moved on. But while dumplings brought the whole family together over a shared pot, our next entry was reserved for one person's birthday alone. Number 4. Hot milk sponge cake. At number 4 is hot milk sponge cake. This was your mother's answer when she wanted something that looked and tasted like it came from a real bakery downtown, without the bakery price tag. The method was deceptively simple but demanded precision. She'd beat eggs and Domino granulated sugar together for what felt like an eternity, using a hand-crank egg beater until the mixture turned pale yellow and thick enough to ribbon off the beaters. While that whipped, she'd scald a cup of Borden's whole milk with a generous pat of Land O'Lakes butter on the stove, letting it get just short of boiling. That hot milk got poured into the egg mixture in a slow, steady stream, while she beat constantly, because dumping it in too fast meant scrambled eggs instead of cake batter, a mistake every mother in the neighborhood had made exactly once. Sifted gold medal flour, Clabber Girl baking powder, and a splash of vanilla extract got folded in gently, and the batter went into 2 greased and floured round tins before sliding into a moderate oven. It rose tall and impossibly light, with a fine, tender crumb that practically dissolved on the tongue. Once cooled, it got stacked and frosted with a simple 7-minute frosting, whipped over a double boiler until it stood in glossy, marshmallow-like peaks. When that cake came out at candle time, every kid at the table went dead silent, eyes locked on the knife, calculating exactly how big a slice they could reasonably ask for. But while this cake ruled the birthday table, our next entry was strictly reserved for the fanciest night of the year. 3. Holiday Scalloped Oysters. Coming in at number 3 is the one dish that signaled the holidays had officially arrived in coastal and inland kitchens alike. Holiday Scalloped Oysters. Unlike the humble corn oysters from earlier in our countdown, these were the genuine article, and they only made an appearance once or twice a year, usually alongside the Thanksgiving or Christmas turkey. Your mother would head to the fish counter for a jar of fresh shucked oysters, a real splurge that meant this dish carried some weight. The base was built entirely from crushed saltine crackers, buttered generously with melted Land O'Lakes butter, and seasoned with a pinch of salt, pepper, and a whisper of cayenne. She'd layer that buttery cracker mixture into a greased casserole dish, followed by a layer of drained oysters, then more crackers, building it up in careful strata like a savory trifle. A mixture of heavy cream and the reserved oyster liquor got poured over the entire dish just before it went into the oven, soaking down through every layer to keep things from drying out. It baked until the top turned deeply golden and slightly crisp, while underneath, the oysters turned plump and tender in their creamy, cracker-thickened bath. It came to the table in the same dish it baked in, usually still bubbling faintly at the edges. Most of the kids eyed it with deep suspicion, but the adults at the table treated it like liquid gold, and a good scalloped oyster dish was the kind of thing relatives would still be talking about at next year's dinner. 2. Old-fashioned divinity. At number 2, just shy of our top spot, is old-fashioned divinity. Making divinity was never attempted lightly. Every mother in the neighborhood knew you didn't dare try it on a humid day, because the sugar syrup would refuse to set and the whole batch would collapse into a sticky, weeping mess. So on a clear, dry winter afternoon, out came the candy thermometer, clipped carefully to the side of a heavy saucepan filled with Domino granulated sugar, Caro corn syrup, and water. That syrup had to reach exactly the hardball stage, and your mother would stand over it the entire time, refusing every distraction, because a few degrees too far in either direction ruined everything. Meanwhile, egg whites were whipped to stiff peaks in a separate bowl, and the moment that syrup hit temperature, she'd pour it into the whites in a thin, steady stream, while the beaters ran continuously. A splash of vanilla and a generous handful of chopped pecans got folded in at the very last second, and then it was a race against the clock, dropping spoonfuls onto waxed paper before the whole batch set up in the bowl. It hardened into pillowy, snow-white clouds with a delicate, almost meringue-like crunch, giving way to a soft, chewy center. These were reserved for Christmas tins and church bake sales, and a failed batch was mourned like a small family tragedy. But nothing on this entire countdown carried more weight, more history, or more Sunday best pride than the dish waiting for us at number 1. 1. Lane cake. And here we are at number 1, the crowning glory of the entire mid-century Southern kitchen. The cake so revered it was written into literature and family legend alike. Lane cake. This was never a casual dessert. A Lane cake announced itself, and making one was treated as a genuine event, often reserved for Christmas, Easter, or a daughter's wedding. Your mother would bake 4 separate delicate white layers from scratch using gold medal flour and a full dozen egg whites whipped to stiff peaks, because a Lane cake's crumb had to be perfectly white, fine, and tender, with no trace of yolk to dull the color. While those layers cooled on wire racks, she turned to the filling, and this was where the real reputation was made. Egg yolks, this time all 12 of them, got cooked slowly with Domino granulated sugar and a generous pour of good bourbon until the mixture thickened into a rich, custardy base. Into that went chopped pecans, a mountain of sweetened baker's shredded coconut, plump raisins, and sometimes a handful of chopped candied cherries, all folded together into a filling so dense it could practically stand on its own. That boozy, fruit-studded filling got spread thick between every layer, and the whole cake was finished with a simple, snow-white, boiled frosting swept into soft peaks with the back of a spoon. It needed to rest overnight, sometimes two, letting the bourbon and coconut filling soften into the cake layers until every bite tasted like it had been aging in a cellar of pure nostalgia. When a Lane cake was carried to the table, conversation actually stopped. This wasn't a dessert you casually helped yourself to. It was sliced with reverence, served in careful, measured portions, and eaten in respectful silence. Because everyone at that table understood exactly how many hours of a mother's Saturday had gone into that first bite. That brings our countdown to a close. So many of these dishes have vanished from our modern tables, but they don't have to stay forgotten. I'd love to know which of these did your mama or grandmother make for you growing up. Thank you for stepping back in time with me today, and I'll see you in the next video.